Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable, and the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why the Australia Institute is publishing our first book as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia from leading thinkers such as Yanis Varoufakis, Auntie Pat Anderson, and Professor Peter Doherty. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to pre-order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
We've got a choice, all of us. We can become human beings again and come back to our true value of what it means to be human within an ecosystem where our ego doesn't take over, but actually our hearts and our souls become a little bit more anchored into our place in society, both with other human beings and with other ecosystems. Or we can continue to destroy ourselves to death because we are the greatest existential threat.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hello, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics, and policy in plain English. I'm Alice Grundy, a research manager at the Australia Institute, standing in for Ebony Bennett, who's unwell this week. Over the next fortnight, global leaders will gather in Baku, Azerbaijan, for the 29th United Nations Climate Change Conference. But with the Paris target of limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius slipping out of reach, there are real concerns about the level of ambition on display at COP29.
Well, this year it comes as scientists say 2024 is set to be the hottest on record.
They are calling this the money COP because the focus is on finance. Negotiators want to agree a new goal for how much money richer countries should be paying to poorer countries to move away from fossil fuels and also adapt their countries to climate change.
President-elect Trump has said he will exit the Paris Climate Agreement again.
The hosts, Azerbaijan, a petro-state, telling the world its oil and gas is, quote,
it's a gift of the God. Every natural resource, whether it's oil, gas, wind, sun, gold, silver, copper, all that are natural resources. And countries should not be blamed for having them.
Secretary General of the UN looked on unimpressed.
The sound you hear is the ticking clock. We are in the final countdown to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And time is not on our side.
It's been pitched as the climate finance COP, but will that actually help the global south in their transition and adaptation efforts? Or will it embed convoluted market mechanisms and dodgy carbon offsets, allowing rich countries to keep on polluting while our Pacific neighbours face rising seas? And all of this is set to happen without addressing the giant elephant in the room, the need to phase out fossil fuels. In late October, we were lucky to host Sandrine Dixson-Declève, co-president of the Club of Rome, in our Canberra studio. Sandrine is an incredibly articulate advocate for our climate and a fairer world. Her most recent book is Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, which sets out a roadmap for a better future. Sandrine joined Ebony to talk about the broken COP negotiations, the false narratives being peddled about the green transition, and why addressing inequality is fundamental to tackling the climate crisis. I hope you enjoy.
I'm so delighted to have you here with us today, Sandrine. For people who aren't familiar with the Club of Rome, I thought we might just start with the kind of work that you do there and what the purpose is, just to give people a bit of context to start us off.
Absolutely. So the Club of Rome was founded in 1968. The reason it's called the Club of Rome is because it was founded by an Italian, Aurelio Pace, who was at the time actually had been CEO of Olivetti in Italy. And he had traveled all over the world and realized that there was something that was going to start explode. He could feel a tension globally. And we think this is in the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, beyond the fact that we had the Vietnam War. this real thought that actually we were going beyond the Earth's limits and that we needed to start to think through population growth and some of what he called the human problématique, the key questions, the blind spots that humanity was starting to really hit in terms of their impact on the planetary boundaries. And there wasn't the planetary boundaries science yet. What he wanted to do was bring together predominantly men, I must say, and predominantly from the West, but decision makers, business leaders, to really think through this human problématique. And so the Club of Rome continued to be an exclusive club of decision makers, thought leaders, many of them economists and scientists, but in the beginning, predominantly business leaders and former policy leaders, thinking through these key challenges, publishing, and in particular working on one of the first big commissions, which was the Limits to Growth, asking a series of MIT scientists led by actually Dennis Meadows at the time to think through this big human problématique and to look at the interrelationships between social and environmental tipping points.
So it's now, I think, something like 50 years since that was published. So how do you see the state of play at the moment globally, particularly when it comes to climate change and these limits to growth?
So what's interesting and quite depressing is, and I'm going to show my age, I guess, is, I was born in 1966, and I think through those 50 years of knowledge that actually we were hitting limits and the fact that we didn't acknowledge the fact that we are. And that's where we are. If you look at some of the main scenarios coming out of the Limits to Growth, and I was showing this yesterday at ANU, you can see that the major tipping points are now in the 2020s. This was predicted by scientists using some of the biggest computer models, because in those days computers were huge, the mainframes, and they already had the algorithms to say and to analyze that we were hitting limits. So what I'm feeling is, okay, we lost 50 years. There is a sense of urgency. Those environmental tipping points are before us. We know we've surpassed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. We know that climate change is upon us. We've seen some of the greatest hurricanes, multiple hurricanes, hitting the U.S. Just recently. We've seen the fires here, the Pantanal and the Amazon are continuing to burn. There are direct. We've seen actually the greatest heat waves that we've ever had, and we've surpassed over the last year more than about 5 days of 1.5 degrees. So we are in a deep emergency situation. And yet, what myself and the leaders at the Club of Rome and so many others believe is we can emerge. We can emerge from emergency. But we need to make some decisions now. And we need to face the music. It's not going to be easy, but that's where we are.
Yeah. I think that's so important to really face that we are in a shift. Things have changed, and that's where we find ourselves now. The title of the webinar today is really towards a well-being economy. If we look at what we want that shift to be, what does a well-being economy mean, and how is it different from the conventional economy that we're in at the moment?
So already, again, in the Limits to Growth, we talked about the extractive economy. And we've, over the last 50 years, talked about the fact that the neoliberal extractive economy is one that does not really service either the planet or people. You can't continue to extract natural resources, especially when you're moving to 9 billion people on this planet. So how do we shift from an extractive economy and just focus on productivity? A well-being economy is one that starts to take into consideration 3 key areas: the environment, the social, and economics. But then look at what matters within our economy. And what we're seeing actually, and this is for me the biggest case now to really shift towards a well-being economy, is that we see across the globe, well, people are getting poorer, inequality is growing, poverty is definitely growing. Our social tension index and our well-being index has shown that social tension is skyrocketing across the globe. Well-being has dramatically decreased because of climate impacts, but also the cost of living. And this is not just because of COVID. This is also because our economies are servicing shareholder value and they're not servicing people. So what we need to do is seriously consider, first of all, is our economy doing what it needs to do, which is fuel the betterment of people and better life for people. And that all the data is saying, no, we have the first generation that's making less than its parents. If that's not happening, then what kind of economic models do we need? And we have enough data to demonstrate that we need models that go beyond GDP, that take into consideration other indicators, and that place a measure, a real metric on well-being. And that well-being can be defined in a variety of different ways. We've got the well-being economies across the globe that are starting to and have shifted in that direction. But we're also seeing many economies across the globe that are realizing, especially post-COVID, that they need to place a value more on the care economy, that they need to place a value more on access to certain services, and that they also need to place a value on the externalities of climate, of environmental impacts.
Today we're here talking about measuring what matters and Australia's first ever national wellbeing framework.
Year-long search for data, giving direction and meaning to the nation's economic and social strengths.
To more closely align what we want for our economy with what we want for our society.
And this is at its most basic, a more sensible, more efficient way of doing government and particularly doing government spending. Because if we can head things off at their source and not have to spend money servicing the failure, then that's a much better outcome, not only for Australians, which is most important, but also in terms of the budget bottom line.
It's really interesting. So in the Australian context, we've seen this current Labor government, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers has made a lot of efforts towards measuring what matters, as he describes it, something that he first announced at one of our events, actually. And the Australia Institute itself has done a lot of work around measuring what matters, really going beyond GDP, like you were talking about there, and towards those things like making sure that the role of the care economy is acknowledged. It feels like Australia has really had a focus on that under this current government. But at the same time, that emergency aspect and the externalities associated with climate change is really much less pronounced and often going in the wrong direction. So very recently, the Environment Minister here approved 3 new coal mine extensions. And Australia, obviously, globally, even though our domestic emissions are huge per capita but small in global terms, we have massive fossil fuel exports. And I think the idea is really for that to expand in future years. So where are governments, including Australia, at when it comes to really acknowledging that this is a climate crisis that we're in and there's actually some hard things that need to be done, that we're not doing that hard work alongside some of the other good work that is happening?
So let me first start by commending Chalmers and his work. I think it's really important that when our leadership stands up, that we commend them for at least looking at the right questions and unpacking them, even if in the end the government doesn't adopt them. So that's the first thing I want to do. The second is that I want to really point to the great Sharon Burrow, who's one of your own, having led the International Trade Union Confederation and having worked with Sharon because she was based in Brussels for many years. And it's under her invitation and also the great invitation of Catherine Trebeck that I'm here, who's been doing all the work on the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. I want to say that Sharon points to something that's very important, and I want to build on this idea of false narratives that we've been fed through the fossil energy industry. The first false narrative, and this is one that really Sharon has honed in on, is the jobs. This narrative that actually we're going to lose so many jobs if we shift out of the fossil energy. And in particular in coal, if you speak to most coal miners, Sharon traveled all over the world, went to Poland, et cetera, had very specific conversations with the coal miners. And it's very clear, as long as coal miners can continue to work, and by the way, most of them don't want their kids to work in a coal mine, as long as they have the skill set to be able to continue to work and stay in their communities, that for them is the most important. So point number one, we are not going to lose jobs if we're able to actually shift those jobs into renewables or into a service industry within the energy sector, which we absolutely need. And that is part of the transformation of any sector, which is that you move forward and train people and bring them on the journey so that they can continue to be part of the economy. That's point number one. Point number two, We know that we have to cap and eliminate emissions from fossil energy, full stop, if we're going to meet our climate goals. Everyone keeps on focusing on the bright, shiny things. Let's invest in new technologies. We started with CCS, and CCS continues to be the big, bright, shiny thing along with hydrogen.
Yeah.
By the way, we were talking about CCS and hydrogen 30 years ago. Yeah. I started my career in oil and gas. These were the bright, shiny things. We have not evolved in either one of them. And everybody says, oh, it's because of the carbon price. Well, of course, the carbon price, the level keeps on shifting. It used to be that we needed at least $50, then we needed $100. Now we need $150 to $200. So we need to start calling bullshit on that.
Mm.
The third key point is the fact that the energy sector right now is actually pulling out of their net zero targets. BP pulled out just last week. We heard from Saudi Aramco this week in Singapore that actually it's too difficult for developing countries to actually make this transition. But no one is talking about the perversities in the market that continue to enable fossil energy, the fossil fuel energy subsidies, the fact that these companies are making $2.8 billion in windfall profits per day on the back of growing energy poverty. Now, if we started to just tax those windfall profits and put in place a just transition fund, we would already start to have the capital that we needed to truly make the shift. And then the last point is, we often don't talk about, first of all, the investments that are going into renewables, the fact that we're now at price parity, and that we can really take it to the next step. So there are so many false narratives that are being thrown at us. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I'm saying there's a lot of positive possibilities of transitioning both towards renewables and to efficiencies. We are so inefficient in our energy use. And as some of our own politicians used to say when we were looking at climate and energy and the new climate and energy package in the late 90s, the best energy is the energy you don't use.
Exactly. Yeah. It's such a straightforward point, and it's so often missing, particularly in the Australian debate. After the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when energy prices went up everywhere, we often hear from Australia's, particularly our gas exports industry, LNG, oh, we've got a shortfall, prices are going up, we don't have enough supply. And it's, all absolutely ridiculous, obviously, really predicated on a false narrative, as you were saying. We really do have to make this shift, essentially, but it's politically difficult. It's actually quite straightforward and simple, as you've just explained what we need to do, but it is politically difficult, I guess.
So doubling down on fossil fuels is absurd. The clean energy revolution is here. No group, no business, and no government can stop it. But you can and must ensure it is fair and fast enough to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. COP29 must tear down the walls of climate finance.
We're coming up to the next COP. How does the COP, if at all, tackle this side of the equation, the expansion of fossil fuels in particular?
So it's incredibly problematic. The last COPs have been hijacked to a certain degree by the fossil fuel industry. Myself and Johan Rockström, climatologist who I know has come to Australia, and he and I have been working, he's also an author of Earth for All, a Survival Guide for Humanity, already coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh, where we saw that there was a real pushback on any language with regard to the phase out. I mean, we keep on talking about transitioning, but we don't specifically talk about phase out or an end to fossil fuel. Already in Sharm, there was big pushback. Not to mention, by the way, that the COP was hosted by a country that had big human rights violations. Fast forward to 1 year later, we find ourselves in Dubai, the biggest trade show ever. These were supposed to be COP negotiations, and I wrote several op-eds and complaints, actually, around the fact that both Sharm el-Sheikh and also Dubai were hosted by governments that had human rights violations, that in some ways, even though there was some real work by the presidency in Dubai, we did see that, again, we were talking to an oil, not only the head of an oil company, but also an oil country and producer. And now we find ourselves in Azerbaijan. And after our pleas, and we sent a letter actually to Simon Steele, who is the Secretary General of, or the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, which is the organization that runs the COPs. We asked myself and Johan Rockström, but also Laurence Toubiana, who is one of the instrumental leaders of the Paris COP, saying very clearly we need to reform these COPs. First, we need to get back to basics. We need to get back to ambition. We had 195 countries that adopted the Paris Agreement, and we're nowhere near it. We had a 1.5 degree declaration. We have surpassed it, and we probably will hit 2 degrees by 2030. So we are not on track. And yet we have these declarations that have been made and these commitments that are being made. And part of the problem is that we are creating negotiations that in the end are not focused on trying to truly achieve a reduction in our carbon emissions. Instead, we're skirting around the big questions. A fossil energy phase out has been taken off the agenda in Baku. Myself and Johan just last week, and I'm announcing it now, but we haven't officially announced it yet, have said that we will most likely not go to Baku in protest, because we both fundamentally believe that if we continue to go, we're actually stepping right in to one of the biggest problems in truly achieving the ambition that we need to shift the bar. And this is supposed to be the decade of action. So I believe now that we are not using wisely these negotiations, that they have become trade shows, that they have not focused on the most essential, because that decision, and you have reported on it so much around the need to move towards fossil fuel phase out, is not even on the agenda. So how can we actually look at each other and say that we're working on climate change?
Yeah. So what you were talking about there, I think, is really interesting. Again, thinking of the Australian context where we've still got very clear targets that we're aiming towards net zero by 2050. But we've recently seen mining magnate and iron ore magnate Twiggy Forrest here really call out the BS basically that's associated with these targets and point out, you know, we're all thinking about net zero in terms of hoping someone else is doing all the actual decarbonisation, and what we need to talk about is real zero and genuine decarbonisation and reduction in emissions. So this conversation isn't happening at the COP, but what about elsewhere across the globe? Is there anywhere that is actually doing this genuine decarbonisation work that countries like Australia, you know, could look to as examples?
So I think it's interesting. There was a real move, I would say, over the since the Paris Agreement, to move in the right direction. We were seeing oil and gas companies diversifying. We were seeing more and more investments in renewables. We actually met our targets in Europe. So there were so many good examples. I sit on the board of a power company in Portugal. Every single one of their targets have been met. By 2030, they will be 100% green power. And this is this is EDP, the National Portuguese Power Company. We saw across Europe that most of our utilities were shifting. And the interesting thing is, while we started to see that progress, we're now seeing the pushback. And the pushback for me is what I call the immorality push, because I truly believe that now it's become immoral. What we're seeing is companies that have interest in fossil energy, those that started to see their profit margins go down while they're making those windfall profits that I declared, right, that are not being taxed and refocused, they have now really started to hunker down and say, we will continue to support a fossil economy. And I don't know how to describe it otherwise, except to say it's immoral. On the back of people struggling. And we're feeding them, and excuse my language, total bullshit about the fact that renewables are making their costs go up, that it is the fault of green energy. As you said yourself, if we look at the Ukrainian invasion, it was the gas crunch. And by the way, in Europe, the entire renewables market is tied to the gas market. So yes, renewable suppliers saw windfall profits too. But part of that was the fact that their prices went up, even though they could have kept them down, because of the way in which our market is structured. So there are so many perversities that are continuing to enable, alongside the immorality of some producers who are saying there is no other way. I fundamentally believe that there is another way. There is a way to start shifting capital. Most investors will say the money is there, but it's not going to the right places. And if we keep on putting out the signals, which is exactly what the oil and gas companies are doing, to the market, to the investors, that actually they'll make less profit by investing in renewables or energy efficiency or green projects, and that they should continue to pour their money into gas and oil, then the market will continue to go in that direction. Hence why this is not just about an energy transformation. It's about the signals of our economy. If our economy is geared towards productivity only, geared towards shareholder value only, where we know that 10% wealthiest own 60 to 80% of our economy, which we fundamentally have to shift, then that immorality will continue to encroach in every single decision that we make, including the courage of politicians, because they're on short-term election cycles, to not actually do the right thing because they're under pressure to, and in the pocket of the oil and gas sector, but other incumbents. I'm very worried about this.
We just see so many echoes of that in Australia, Sandrine, and obviously it's what I'm more familiar with, but I can see a lot of what you're talking about happening in the current Australian context, essentially. And so before we move on, I'll point some people towards, we've measured the number of fossil fuel subsidies operating in Australia. It's about 14.5 billion last year. There's things
and globally it's in the trillions.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we saw all those windfall profits happening. We didn't tax them here in Australia either. The government actually brings in more money from students paying for their university degrees here than they do from the petroleum resource rent tax, our major tax on the gas industry.
And Warren Buffett, has declared that his housekeeper is paying more tax than he is.
Exactly. So that was the question that I wanted to come back to before we kind of come to questions from the audience, which is the role of, I guess, inequality here, because we have seen post-COVID inflation rise globally. A lot of people are struggling to make ends meet. It's obviously affecting both developed and developing countries, but much more acutely in the rest of the world. Yet we're still kind of not seeing developed countries like Australia really pull their weight. Here we've got a big contrast between our Pacific Island neighbours, who are obviously facing an existential threat from climate change and sea level rise, kind of looking to Australia, looking at our fossil fuel expansion and really wondering how that all works. But here it's really been dominated by, we can't afford to do these things. You know, energy prices become a big conversation. So how important is really tackling and reducing inequality as part of doing what needs to be done when it comes to addressing the climate crisis?
Fundamental. So our analysis that we undertook when it was the 50th anniversary of the Limits to Growth, and we published Earth for All, a Survival Guide for Humanity, bringing together scientists and economists, showed that the speed and scale of the change with regard to staying within the operating space from a planetary perspective is directly linked to fighting inequality and poverty. I can't speak to the Australian case, although I have many friends who live on the islands and who are also saying to me, by the way, you talk about missing 50 years. We're now talking about the next 10 years having to move off our island and our ancestors deciding whether we stay with them and we just commit collective suicide, which can you imagine? What a choice. Or we move to Papua New Guinea where we know we're not welcome. I mean, here's the decision-making factor. And I often say, by the way, we could all be refugees, every single one of us, because we now are saying that the climate impacts are hitting all of us. But to come back to that very question, if we look at supposedly the greatest democracy, the greatest neoliberal economy in the world, the United States, where I grew up as an immigrant from Belgium, and I look at the Bay Area and how it has totally played out why neoliberal extractive economies don't work. Yeah, it worked during the 80s when it was the Boons Day. It worked when we had the big .com boom. But now we're seeing no trickle down. We're seeing a housing crisis because no one can afford to live in San Francisco. We're seeing a city that used to be the great gem of the United States now being called Poop Town. And we're seeing more homelessness, suicide rates, mental illness, people walking in the streets in their pajamas than we've ever seen in our entire lives. This is an American dream that has turned into an American nightmare. And by the way, we're being told in Europe by the new Draghi report that we need to go into more of a neoliberal American model. And I say to that, you have the perfect example of what could go wrong. This is the moment to start thinking through how we can do things differently. We have enabled inequality by the immorality of the uber rich who hold so much of the wealth and do not redistribute it because they don't pay taxes. And those uber rich, you can call them also the oil and gas company, who also do not take and pay taxes because we've enabled shareholder value and rentierism and profit to go in the hands of a few rather than the many. Now, you may say to me, well, who cares? Because I'm doing well and I can bunker myself away. And, there is parts of the economy that, like me, can just build big houses and pretend that it doesn't exist. But instability is going to come in so many different ways. And we see it. We see it in terms of the revolt of the people, where people are starting to, first of all, kick you out of certain cities because it's becoming quite uncomfortable. We can see it in climate impacts, because we've basically used up our natural resources and thought we could extract ourselves to death and never have an impact on the planet. We see it in terms of pandemics because we are encroaching on our biodiversity and our ecosystems. And therefore, now it's starting to bite back at us because we're getting too close. We will have more climate impacts, more pandemics. And with growing inequality, we are basically creating a nightmare scenario. It is time now to sit up and smell the coffee and say, okay, we've got a choice. All of us, we can become human beings again and come back to our true value of what it means to be human within an ecosystem where our ego doesn't take over, but actually our hearts and our souls become a little bit more anchored into our place in society, both with other human beings and with other ecosystems. Or we can continue to destroy ourselves to death because we are the greatest existential threat.
That's where we'll leave this episode of Follow the Money. Thanks so much to Sandrine Dixson-Declève for joining us in the studio. The discussion was recorded on Thursday, 24 October, and some things may have changed since then. You will have heard at the start of this episode that the Australia Institute is publishing our first book as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia from leading thinkers such as Yanis Varoufakis, Auntie Pat Anderson, and Professor Peter Doherty. You can pre-order it now via our website, australiainstitute.org.au. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today. You can reach out to us via email at podcast@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Alice Grundy. Thank you for listening.